Scales, the DNA of music. Why do I call it the DNA of music? Because composers use scales as structures to create relationships within musical compositions. The author defines scales as specific collections of pitches that are selected for composition. And typically we see them ordered as ascending and descending. Most often musicians will practice scales with the hopes to achieve facility on an instrument or within the voice so that performance of musical compositions based on scales is easier and more fluid. When we think about the term scale, there are numerous associations with this term. If we go to the dictionary, we can see that a scale can mean a balance, as in chemistry, or as in a way to measure weight. A scale can mean a certain size and scope, but we can also understand scale as a verb. We can scale a mountain. And also, we have scale as a component of the anatomy of a fish. We have scales on a fish, but we also can scale a fish as we remove the scales to prepare a fish for eating. The term scale comes from scala, or the Greek, Latin, and Italian origin for scales or ladder. And in the picture you can see that they're ascending the steps, and this is an excellent example of how you can understand a scale as being one step at a time to get to a greater purpose. Let's listen to some scales that are common to the Western canon of music. And by that I mean Western music as in Euro-American music. Okay? The first scale is the major scale. This we understand as the do-re-mi scale. I performed it ascending and descending at the piano. Also the harmonic minor. Pentatonic. The blues scale comes in various forms, most often in this form. A Dorian scale. Octatonic. And chromatic. Each of these scales I presented an ascending and descending order. Each scale is based on a standardized pattern. And in this chapter, we're going to learn all the standardized patterns for each of these types of scales. Scales can be broken into three types: diatonic scales, non-diatonic, and non-Western scales. Diatonic scales are the most common types of scales. These are the scales that we have been using for several hundred years. Diatonic scales contain each of the letters of the musical alphabet. For example, 1C, 1D, 1E, F, G, A, B, and C. You have to have one of each type of alphabetical note. They could be sharp, they could be flat, but you must have at least one type to have a diatonic scale. The term dia really means second. A dyad really refers to two notes that are a second apart. For example, C and D, or E and F. Now we can measure the distance between any two notes that form a dyad in terms of half steps. But at the end of the day, a dyad or a diatonic scale must have one of each representative of the musical alphabet when it comes to the notation of the scale. Non-diatonic scales, such as the octatonic scale, or perhaps the whole tone scale, or even the pentatonic scale, will have repetitions or gaps in the musical alphabet. For example, when it comes to the octatonic scale, it's based on half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. Because there are 8 notes in the scale, one of the alphabetic notes must be repeated. And then we have non-Western scales. These scales are oftentimes difficult to replicate on a piano because they require quarter tones and half tones and different tuning systems that are not represented in Western music. Those scales won't be performed here as a result. Our big hurdle here is to understand the diatonic scales. That is a major component of the undergraduate degree program. All undergraduates must master the diatonic scales and the concept of the relationship between all diatonic scales. So you can think of a scale as a series of ascending steps, as you saw on the slide. But more importantly, be thinking about the musical alphabet as it alphabetizes itself in order. For example, if your diatonic scale starts on G, the diatonic scale alphabet would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, because we always wrap to the octave. It must include one of each letter in the musical alphabet, and they must appear in alphabetical order. And so, like I said, die meaning two. We can extend this to tri, quad, quint, or quart, quartal, quintal, hexachordal, heptatonic, octatonic, dodecaphonic. There are all kinds of ways that we describe units of relationships in music. Okay, and we use these. We're going to start with tetra and diatonic and tetrachord. Tetra meaning a group of 4 notes. We're going to start with the C major scale and major scales in general. Now, it may seem strange because the musical alphabet has 7 letters, but a scale will always contain 8 notes because a scale is based on the spatial relationship between each note in terms of its interval as a half step or a whole step. We're also going to define what it means to be the tonic pitch and the tetrachord, as well as the dominant pitch and the upper tetrachord. And then the language of accidentals will come into play as we learned from the first module or chapter 1. Now, anyone can play a C major scale on the piano if you just simply sit down at the piano and start with middle C and play all the keys that are white in order with one finger. Okay? This is because the piano is a C instrument. It is designed with the scale of C major in mind. C major is the most fundamental, easiest key to play. It's the easiest scale to play. But we'll take a more closer examination of that scale in the next slide. If we look at the C major scale as 2 groups of 4 notes, okay? 2 tetrachords, a lower and an upper. We notice that the lower tetrachord, upon examining the keyboard, we see a whole step between C and D, a whole step between D and E, and a half step between E and F. And we find that same pattern replicated amongst the notes that make up the upper group of 4. The terms we're going to use for these 2 components are lower tetrachord, C, D, E, F, and upper tetrachord, G, A, B, C. We understand the separation of the 2 as a whole step. That's why it's in parentheses. The term tonic refers to the point of initiation. The tonic is C. The dominant is the point of initiation of the upper tetrachord, which is G. The tonic, C. The dominant is G. These 2 tetrachords have the exact same pattern. That is critical to understand because all major scales share that same principle. Another way I've seen this presented is like a pattern of numbers. Whole step meaning 2 and half step meaning 1. In other words, a phone number, 221-2221. When we begin to move the formula for the major scale, the 2 tetrachord formula, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, separated by the whole step, we will need to apply accidentals to adjust pitch. When we move the formula, we are really moving the formula to other tonics. For instance, C major, G major, and F major. Accidentals are always used to adjust pitch. Sharps raise pitch, and flats lower pitch, both by 1 semitone. The G major scale, for instance, if we begin with G as the tonic and we lay out 8 pitches on a staff, we can divide this into tetrachords and then we can check spacing. And as we notice that we have to adjust with accidentals to include an F sharp to make the pattern fit the scale. An example will follow. One way to check your major scales is to divide the tetrachords between your hands. And that is to say that eliminating the thumbs of your hands and just focusing on the tetrachords. Place the notes of the lower tetrachord underneath your fingers, excluding the thumb, with your pinky on the tonic, and then matching the upper tetrachord with your right hand. You'll be able to play a major scale. And if done correctly, if played in reverse, you'll hear the tune Joy to the World. I recommend running the scale in ascending and descending order until each scale is fluent underneath your fingers at the keyboard. That is to say, with your little finger of your left hand placed on any piano key and conforming the pattern of whole, whole, half, separate by whole, and upper tetrachord, whole, whole, half. As you learn to study the piano, you will learn a piano fingering that allows for the performance of a scale with one hand. That is the function of a piano course. If we transpose this pattern, if we move this pattern up and down the keyboard, we will come up with potentially 12 major scales, 12 patterns. But when we notate those 12 patterns, it turns out that there's actually 15 potential patterns. One with no sharps and flats, being C major, 7 with sharps, and 7 with flats. And this is because we must understand that tetrachords are an axiom. They're a pattern. The tonic tetrachord of a major scale is the dominant tetrachord of another major scale because they share the same pattern. Therefore, the dominant tetrachord of a major scale must be the tonic tetrachord of another major scale. And if that sounds like Dr. Seuss, you are correct. For example, if we consider the tonic tetrachord of C major and the dominant tetrachord of C major, the dominant tetrachord of C major is the tonic tetrachord of G major. And that is illustrated in the textbook, as you'll see in another video. These are called related major scales. Related major scales share tetrachords. So in other words, an upper tetrachord or a lower tetrachord matches tetrachords in various major scales. And there are some very interesting exercises in the book to facilitate practice with these axioms. Finally, major scales will never mix accidentals or feature a double accidental. This is another principle of major scales. Major scales will never mix sharps and flats or feature double sharps and double flats. This is why the diatonic concept of running the scale from line to space is critical. Otherwise, one could easily make a mistake with enharmonics, breaking the rule of the diatonic concept. So 15 major scales are possible. As I said, one with no accidentals, that would be C major as represented by the piano, and then 7 with sharps and 7 with flats. And you can see their tonics on this slide. I would make a note of it. Again, this is going to come up again. As a result, many horn players and musicians debate the necessity for understanding the enharmonic scales, scales that can be spelled the same, scales that sound the same, but can be spelled differently. For example, a D-flat major scale and a C-sharp major scale, or the other ones listed on the slide. When it comes to the organization of scales, considering the accidentals that are required for adjustment to make a scale conform to the pattern is critical. As we begin to organize scales, we can see that if I have one scale that includes a flat, the flat is B flat. If I have a scale that requires 2 flats, those flats are B flat and E flat. A scale with 3 flats, B flat, E flat, and A flat. And likewise with sharps. A 1 sharp scale is F sharp. A 2 sharp scale, F sharp, C sharp, and so forth. A 7 sharp scale would include all 7 sharps. F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D, A, E, and B sharp. All sharps would be populated. It's important to remember this order of accidentals that I call the accidental counter. You can remember your accidental counter as an acronym. For instance, BEAD GCF, or BEAD, go catch fish. Or in the reverse, Father Charles goes down and ends battle. Here's another way to look at it. Accidental counter acronyms, sharps and flats. Flats accumulate as we begin to create major scales in the opposite order of the sharps. In the flats, battle ends and down goes Charles' father, or BEAD, go catch fish. And then the sharps can be easily remembered as Father Charles goes down and ends battle. It is important to remember that closely related scales are scales that share tetrachords. This is going to become increasingly more important going forward into Music Theory 2 and Music Theory 3 and Music Theory 4. Because as composers began to explore relationships between scales, a music theory student must anticipate that this is possible. If your folder includes a symphony in the key of G major, one must anticipate that not only would the scale of G major be in force, but also the scale of G major, the scale of D major, the scale of C major. These are closely related scales. Okay? Or in the example on the slide, a piece of music in the key of C major has closely related scales, F major and G major. And this is because of their tonic and dominant tetrachord relationships. You are going to see various manifestations of circles of fifths. These circles organize scales based on the principle of closely related scales around a clockwise motion, both counter and in clockwise motion. You will also see at the lower region of the circle of fifths this enharmonic series of scales that are called the enharmonic region. This is an extremely powerful tool for both theorists and performers, and sometimes it's turned around and described as the circle of fourths by those that perform in the jazz idiom. And then some theorists will also describe this as an expression of the golden ratio. For the circle of fifths, the 15 possible tonics are arranged in a circle. The 15 tonics arranged in the circle organize the tonics such that the closely related scales by their tetrachords show dominant tonic relationships as well as subdominant relationships, which we'll talk about later. The enharmonic region has overlaps of enharmonic possibilities. The circle of fifths should be quickly constructible and easily navigated by any music theory student. Here you can see a circle of fifths. We see both major keys and minor keys. Focusing on the major keys, which are in the ellipses, we can see C major, G major, and F major at the 12, 1, and 11 o'clock positions. These are closely related keys because C major's dominant tetrachord is the lower tetrachord of G major, and it is the upper tetrachord of F major. And as we look at groups of scales in threes, for example, D major, G major, and A major, or F, B flat, and E flat, these adjacent relationships form closely related relationships on this circle of fifths. The only way that one can understand this tactile, in other words, under your fingers, is by practicing the piano or one's instrument to understand which notes, which key patterns are the same. The golden ratio, or the golden mean here in this slide, it describes a proportion of 3 to 2. And this is the way that we tune the perfect fifth. It's not quite perfect. Not quite like the octave, which is tuned at 1 to 2. Three to 2 yields an irrational number. But we've decided that the perfect fifth is the compromise, along with the major third, that allows us to play all 12 keys, all 15 keys, including the enharmonics, as possible keys that we can play. Examples of the golden ratio are found in all kinds of places in the world of non-music. An example would be a pentagram. I'll show you some slides later. The dodecaphonic spiral in nature. Okay, this is related to mathematics. Again, you'll see a slide here in a second. Some say that the great wonders of the world were based on this relationship of proportionality of imperfection of 2 to 3. And then, of course, we have Fibonacci's famous numbers that show a relationship of 2 to 3 and 5 to 3 eventually, as we get through the sequence. Here you can see an example of how A and B are proportionate. So if tonic is A and dominant is B, you can see their proportion in the way that they may be tuned. And this is the compromise that I'm talking about. We can see this proportion also in various artworks as referred to in the last slide. In nature, as shells grow in spirals. As galaxies form. And even as Trump styles his hair. So it begs to try to figure out the circle of fifths. If, in fact, the perfect fifth is indicative of the dodecaphonic spiral, then is it really a circle? Or is it, in fact, a spiral? So now we cross into the realm of music theory, really. Do enharmonic scales actually exist? A horn player would probably say no. What if we have double accidentals or triple sharps? If we think about the circle of fifths as being a spiral, then it becomes an infinite expression of enharmonics. That's the beauty of this concept of the major scale. And I'll leave you with this, that if we understand the fundamental concept that we have a lower tetrachord and an upper tetrachord as having a same pattern, we can transpose that pattern into infinity and represent it in notation in all kinds of ways. The difference is that we may be able to do that as theorists, but practically there are really only 15 ways that musicians understand those simple expressions of tetrachords as tonics and dominants. And there is the end of this presentation. The next presentation will be more practical, and we will work on actually constructing these scales using these practical methods.